On episode 416 of the 40 Plus Fitness podcast, we meet Dr. Arthur Agatston and discuss his book, The New Keto-Friendly South Beach Diet. You can find the full show notes for this episode at 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/416. Have you decided you're ready to make a change? To reclaim your health and fitness? The 40 Plus Fitness podcast is here for you. I'm your host, Alan Meisner. I'm an NSAM certified personal trainer with a specialization in corrective exercise and fitness nutrition. Let me be your coach as you find your way on your health and fitness journey. All right, let's go. Our guest today was the originator of the extremely famous South Beach Diet. He has come back with a few little tweaks, making it keto-friendly. With no further ado, here's Dr. Arthur Agatston. Dr. Agatston, welcome to 40 Plus Fitness.
Great to be with you, Alan.
Your new book is called The New Keto-Friendly South Beach Diet. And I want to say, okay, I knew about the South Beach Diet, but it came out at a time in my life when I didn't really have to think about what I was eating or what I was doing. So I was familiar with it being, kind of more of a whole food protein style diet, not dissimilar from some of the other stuff that was out there like Atkins and whatnot, but still very effective. A lot of people that I knew that did the South Beach diet really got good effect.
Yes, and I must say, you weren't that interested then. I was not that interested in diet. I was always thin until I realized I didn't realize it then, but I was addicted to sugar, and I was what I call pre-diabetic, even though my blood sugars, everything appeared normal. But once I got off the bad carbohydrates and sugar, I lost weight. And it was, I guess, in my early 40s, and I love your show, the 40 Plus Fitness, because things change as we age. We get more fat, less lean body mass, less muscle and bone, and exercise, sleep, and proper diet becomes more and more important as we age, although our youth today are in big trouble with their diets. So it starts early, but it is tougher. It is tougher as we age.
Yeah, and I definitely want to get into some of the warning flags and things that we can look to before we get there, because again, the doctors are going to say, "Oh, your A1C is fine. Keep eating the way you're eating." That's not really necessarily the answer, because historically, if we look back and you think about it, and you talked about bears hibernating, but in a sense, human beings, we went through feast and famine ourselves.
Yes, absolutely.
And we would get into that. We get into that same season when the bear's fattening himself up, and we're finding the berries and the nuts, and we're just gorging on that stuff. So our bodies were kind of pre-wired to put us into for lack of a better word, what you call you were doing it like binging, like you would eat a part of a blueberry pie and then you'd go back and eat the rest of it. I think that's just natural for us to do.
Yes, no, I do love the grizzly bear analogy. We're always either storing food for either an overnight fast when we're going to sleep, or in our history, it was more often for times of famine. And it's all mammals, but it's really almost all living. Ever since we became multicellular organisms, we had to have a way of storing energy to use when there was no energy available from the environment. And so the fat storage mode, where when we eat, whether carbohydrate, sugar turns into fat, other than what we're burning for our immediate needs. And it's stored as fat, and to some degree as starch or glycogen in our liver and our muscle. And usually we needed that not only when we slept and weren't eating, but we never had the luxury of 3 meals a day in most of our history. We were, in a sense, doing intermittent fasting, which gave us time for our insulin levels to go down. When we ate, our insulin levels go up. We store starch and fat. And when it goes down, we burn it for energy. And that important survival mechanism has been totally upside down. When we have only feast, we don't have famine. And so we're storing fat indefinitely and really creating physiologic problems that we never had in our natural existence. And it's most recently, it's the abuse of sugar, high fructose corn syrup, which has been important because when it was introduced, it was ubiquitous really in everything, and often a hidden killer in a sense. And our intake of sugar went up tremendously, really starting in the 1980s at the beginning of our obesity epidemic. And people didn't realize they were consuming all this sugar. And it was turning into fat being stored for a famine that never comes. And that's what's really messed up our physiology and caused all the modern diseases. We think of obesity, we think of diabetes, we think of heart disease, but it's cancer, it's depression, it's Alzheimer's. And every time we bring our standard American diet, called the SAD diet, to another country, whether it's Dubai, Mumbai, Beijing, Tokyo, they get all the Western diseases, not just diabetes and obesity, but increased rates of cancer, again, and Alzheimer's, autoimmune disease, all our chronic disease. And what we often see now is when people came from more traditional diets like Asians, the Japanese have been studied carefully. When they move from Tokyo to Hawaii to San Francisco to the rest of the United States, we've known for years they get increased heart attacks, but they also get increased cancer. Particularly breast cancer has been very well studied in Japanese women from Tokyo to the Midwestern United States. And so the cancer goes up as well as the obesity, the diabetes, and the heart disease.
Yeah. So one of the things that you got into in the book is, okay, so you had, we had the South Beach diet, and for a lot of people that was very useful because they went through a phase where they kind of allowed their body to change its insulin mode, and effectively then after that short phase, they could go on and start reintroducing some of the foods they ate before till they kind of found that balance of a whole food diet that was basically much more nutritious for them. But you've adapted that so that the new Keto-Friendly South Beach diet is just a little different. Can you kind of compare and contrast those and why you use the term keto-friendly versus just making it a keto diet?
Yes. One of the first things that in the original South Beach diet, the first phase, which was the low, almost keto phase, only went for 2 weeks. And what we know now is once it did get rid of cravings, but the other thing that happens when you're low carb, low sugar, low processed foods is when you run out of your starch, your glycogen stores in your liver and your muscle, you then have to get fat adapted, which means you really turn on the hormones, the enzymes that break down fat and make it useful. One of the best examples is the traditional marathon runners who did carbohydrate loading the night before the marathon. And the idea was to fill their livers and their muscle with as much starch, glycogen, that's the storage form of sugar, as they could, because within 2 to 3 hours running the marathon, they would run out of the sugar glycogen stores and they had to burn fat. And they weren't good at it. So that was called hitting the wall. And they ran out of energy. Now, long distance runners have learned to be fat adapted. And that takes 1 to many months. And it continues. And I've had that experience myself. So instead of just the first phase being 2 weeks, we go for 1 to many months of low processed carb, low sugar, so that we can learn to use our fat for energy. And the first fat that goes is the belly fat. And today, it's interesting, the long endurance runners, the people doing triathlons and even more than marathons, are going low carb, and they don't hit the wall. They burn their fat very well. Now, for the rest of us, it takes 12 hours to a day. It's individual, where you deplete your glycogen stores, and you begin to burn more fat and become fat adapted. And allowing for that's very important. When I first became really strict and good, it's when I realized I was truly addicted to sugar, and I went cold turkey. And once, by the way, I understood that I was truly addicted to sugar, that when I cheated, it wasn't a lack of self-discipline. And what would happen to me is I could lose my cravings on the first phase of the South Beach diet. But when I went to the second phase, I would invariably have a fruit or maybe even a whole grain bread, or a dessert, and I wouldn't stop. And now we know it's not a lack of self-discipline. It's truly an addiction. And many Americans, especially overweight Americans, are addicted. But once I got off that addiction and stayed on sort of the traditional phase one of the South Beach diet, I started the diet while on vacation, and I came back and I returned to my boxing, which I did regularly. And I recall vividly, it was a Tuesday morning in late September, very hot in South Florida. And normally I would take a round or two off when I did my boxing. And all of a sudden, I didn't have to take a round off. I went continuously for 8 rounds, and now I do 12 rounds, 3-minute rounds with a minute and a half rest instead of a minute.
I do have to say this. If you haven't done boxing as a workout, 3 minutes is an eternity. I have some clients I do some boxing with, and we'll go for a minute. I've gotten one of them up to about a minute and a half, and they're done. Like, I need a break. And so just even going a 3-minute round is saying something. But for you to have the endurance to be able to go round after round with about a minute rest between rounds, that's pretty impressive.
For my tender young age, I take an extra 30 seconds in between rounds.
Okay,
but I have
still 3 minutes is a lot of time to keep moving.
Yes, and I couldn't, in hot, difficult conditions, I would always take rounds off. And since I'm fat adapted, I don't. I feel better physically and mentally, and that much more than the cosmetics of losing my belly. And then remember, I was a diet doctor. My wife used to say, Arthur, no more TV for you, only radio, unless you get rid of that little belly. And so, but it's much more the way I feel. And since we've been more flexible with our patients, the results we see are incredible. And besides the fat adaptation, the longer sort of phase one, the other idea is you don't have to be in full ketosis. Actually, when we're in the fat burning mode, we're often in ketosis. It's just levels we can't measure easily by current methods. But you can lose the belly. You get all the benefits without actually being in ketosis. The big advantage of ketosis, particularly for people who are diabetic, who really want to jump into something strict, is you can measure your ketosis and you can document compliance, and that's good for us often and our patients. But to make the diet a lifestyle, there still has to be more flexibility. We also encourage either time-restricted feeding or intermittent fasting. And we do suggest that with full keto, with fasting, that you do it with a nutritionist, a health coach, or your physician, so that you can avoid problems such as what's called the keto flu. But so we are flexible in our approach depending on our patient the needs, the desires. And you can even be a vegetarian, low carb, as long as you're having whole foods and not having the processed carbs. It's tougher, but you can do it. And of course, traditional societies, again, like the Asians, with rice, and the Okinawans with sweet potatoes. They were some of the, well, particularly the Okinawans were some of the longest lived populations in the world, but they didn't eat snacks all day. They didn't eat frequently. And now, to the degree that sugar has shown its ugly face in all these societies, they are becoming overweight, diabetic, and all the Western diseases that have been in the United States for decades.
When you put this together, I mean, because one of the things you said, and I think that's really important is, well, a couple of different things, but one that I think is really important is that we all are going to have different needs. We're all going to be slightly different from a biology perspective of how we want to apply this. So there is a lot of flexibility to this to say, I know, okay, if I need to lose 30 pounds or I am diabetic, I'm probably going to stay in phase one and be a little bit more strict and probably get to a point where I am in ketosis, if not completely, at least most of the time, I'm eating at that low carb. But you have 12 rules for what you call keto-friendly eating. Could you just kind of go through those rules with us? Because I think that'll make a lot more sense to folks when they see, okay, it is really kind of flexible. 12 rules sounds like a lot, but they're just the basics of, if you're eating this way, you're going to be much more healthy.
Yes, and by the way, yeah, you got it exactly, because the flexibility is we all come with different degrees of what we call the thrifty gene, and the tendency towards becoming diabetic ultimately. And so the rules are, first, minimize sugars is number one, and we might say no sugars, but our parents and grandparents who had a sugar cube in their coffee was a lot different with the amount of sugar we're getting today. And so you can burn some sugar without having storing it. It's the volume that is totally off the charts today. And refined carbohydrates, the refined carbohydrates are absorbed more rapidly than the whole grain or high fiber carbohydrates. And by being absorbed more rapidly, it's called, actually, something called the incretin effect, but they increase our insulin levels out of proportion to just the increase in blood sugar alone. So if you give blood sugar a certain amount intravenously through the vein, the blood sugar goes up a little bit and the insulin goes up a little bit. But when you consume it, then you stimulate hormones. It's something called GIP, which causes an exaggerated increase in insulin. And that's the problem with frequent feeding and then snacking, which we used to say, like everybody said with the original South Beach Diet, have frequent snacks to stabilize your blood sugar, your insulin levels. That was just plain wrong. So the third rule is limit snacking. You want to give time for your insulin levels to drop. And that's where having very low glycemic foods, whole foods, or nothing for breakfast and lunch, that allows your insulin levels to go down. And that's when you can start burning fat. When your insulin levels are high, you block the burning of your fat stores. So you can be, once the insulin levels stay high and you can't access your fat stores, you can be starving and you run to the fast food restaurant, or you have a Coke that doesn't even fill you up. So you want to give time for your insulin levels to drop by not snacking, having fewer larger meals, which is the next in the 12 rules, or having foods that are absorbed further down in the intestine and don't increase your blood sugar and your insulin levels. We say maximize the healthy fats, and one of the things is while some people I know don't like dairy because they're sensitive to it, both saturated fat in meats, in dairy, we now know raises your large LDL, bad cholesterol particles, and they do not cause heart disease. This is relatively recent knowledge, but it's been repeated in several large studies. It's the small LDL particles that cause heart disease, and they come from sugar and bad carbohydrates. And one other point about the bad carbohydrates is, again, it's volume. Because when you have a bad carbohydrate, you either burn it, or if it's glucose, not sugar, you can store it as glycogen, as starch, but only so much, about 700 calories. Then it turns into fat.
Yeah, but that's part of the problem is these these processed carbohydrates are processed to basically make us eat more. That's what the food manufacturers are doing. You don't eat, like they say, you're not going to eat one Pringle.
Yes.
You could eat one Pringle and maybe you'd love the taste of it and that would be all you needed. Your body could absorb that and you'd be fine. But invariably, it's a long sleeve and you're not just going to eat one.
Yes, absolutely. And one of my favorite books by Dr. Robert Lustig from UC San Francisco, The Hacking of the American Mind. And he talks about how the food companies make us addicted. And yeah, I mean, sugar, actually, another friend, Dr. David Ludwig, did a study where they gave Cokes to teenagers before they went into a fast food restaurant. And they ate more, not less, because the fructose, the sugar in the Cokes, does not suppress your appetite. It actually increases it. And again, those processed carbohydrates, including sugar, are absorbed at the beginning of your small intestine, so you get that bad incretin effect where your insulin goes way up, and sugar is not turned into starch or glycogen in your liver. It's either burnt or it's turned into fat right away. So a high sugar diet is a high fat diet. And then we say, limit the omega-6 vegetable oils. Of course, the original vegetable oils, and they're not made from vegetables, they're made from seeds. The first were made from cotton seeds. Now, soybean and many other types. And they were hydrogenated for shelf life. And that was shown not to be healthy, to be very unhealthy. They were outlawed. But instead of going to just traditional saturated fats, such as lard, butter, coconut oils, or olive oils, they're going into non-hydrogenated vegetable oils. And I would not, in amounts that Americans were never, and the humans in general were never exposed to naturally. We need small amounts of these oils. They're called omega-6 oils, which today are the vegetable oils, and small amounts are fine. But when you process them and create the salad dressings, the cooking oils, we were never meant to have that many oils, and it throws out our omega-6 inflammatory measures to omega-3 oils, which are anti-inflammatory. So where our ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 should be from 1 to 4 to 5 to 1, in most Americans, it's greater than 10 to 1. And so you should be avoiding all vegetable oils as far as I'm concerned. It's pro-inflammatory. But vegetables and the non-starchy vegetables, the asparagus and broccoli and Brussels sprouts and green leafy vegetables, the spinach, those are all good. Yet when the problem is when we always talk about fruits and vegetables, because a lot of fruits have a lot of fructose, particularly the tropical fruits. So fruits have antioxidants. They can be good for us when it's a whole fruit in the form of a berry. But a lot of people think they're being healthy because they're having a lot of fruits, and they can overdo it because of the sugar and the fructose that makes the fruit sweet. So we shouldn't be always lumping vegetables and fruits together. And then a wide variety of meats, poultry, seafood, all very nutrient rich, and eat primarily whole foods. The best example of this, I think, is the steel cut, truly whole grain oats versus instant oatmeal. And with actually the same amount of fiber, when you have the steel cut oatmeal, the sugar or the starch core of the oat is surrounded by fiber. It takes a while to digest. It releases the starch, the sugar into the bloodstream slowly, and you stimulate enzymes further down in the intestine that are good. When you have processed instant oatmeal, even if you have the same amount of fiber, it's not surrounding the starch core, and so it's absorbed much more rapidly. The enzymes, the hormones have direct access to the starch. It turns to sugar instantaneously, and that increases your insulin levels rapidly. And you're much hungrier. The studies have been done. You're much hungrier sooner than if you have the steel cut true oatmeal. So, and that's true of eating whole foods. And that means whole foods. Adding the fiber in separately, there's just a lot less evidence that that's helpful. And flexibility. It's more important not to be snacking and not to be eating frequently, often, than sometimes what you're eating. If you're eating in a relatively small window or doing intermittent fasting, I hate to say you can get away with more because you do increase your starch stores and your insulin, but then you have a long period of time to burn off that starch and the fat that's been consumed. So we prefer whole good foods all the time, but if you're going to cheat, cheating in a short window is much better than if you're grazing and eating all day. That's disaster. That we're snacking. It's very well documented. We're eating many more times per day than we were in the 1970s. And it is because we're walking around hungry all day, because our blood sugars are swinging around and our insulin levels are high, and we don't have access to that big store of fat in our bellies.
Well, and I think flexibility is important, but we're not talking about a license to just say, okay, I'm going to allow myself to have a piece of cake every night because I can. I'm only having, 2 big meals a day, and therefore I know I can have, and that's great. But if you're wanting weight loss, if you're diabetic or pre-diabetic, or as we're going to get into in a minute, pre-diabetic,
yeah,
then you have to understand, or you know you're addicted to sugar. You really have to think hard about how you can approach this and use this diet as a tool to get yourself healthy, to get yourself off that addiction, because it's possible. But if you're going to start the game cheating, you're probably not going to get there very fast.
And by the way, I mean, that is the mistake that I frequently made without knowing it. But even now, I mean, in the holiday season, if I'm at an affair and this has happened, and I eat the wrong food, the addiction comes back so quickly. And other than the knowledge of I can't do this, or I can't keep doing this, and I can get back on the wagon pretty quickly. But you're absolutely right. This is not a license to be cheating every night. I mean, the good thing, if it's once a month, or somebody loves their pasta meal and there's a good amount of protein with it, and that's again depending on the individual. Some people will immediately fall off the wagon and get into big trouble. Others, I always have patients who don't have the sweet tooth I have, and they can have a bite or something and have a bite. In Miami, we have Joe's Stone Crab and their key lime pie, and I generally cannot have just one bite, so I don't have it all. And others can, including my wife. So that's knowing how each of us are as individuals.
And that's one of the things I liked about your book was it took that into account and said, because now you've dealt with thousands of patients and yourself, and it's like, we're all going to have to approach this slightly differently, and we're going to have to figure out what works for us. And we're just going to have to be self-aware that, if we have this addiction, if we have this issue. One of the things you had in the book, which I thought was really, really important, because by the time you go to the doctor and your A1C is over 6, and they're going to start now diagnosing you with diabetes, you're way down the road. And you talk about some tests, some things we can look at before we even get to that point. And so these are tests I'm actually kind of interested in having done, because my A1C is great. My blood sugar is great. But that doesn't mean I'm out of the woods. It just might mean that right now my body's creating a ton of insulin and it's able to shuttle all of that blood sugar away, so I don't stay in a high blood sugar state. So one of them you called was basically the insulin resistance test, or insulin, and then the other one was called the Agatston calcium score.
Yes, the first is, as far as the points you just made about insulin are so important. So in fact, if we take in America healthy young 20-year-olds, not overweight, today versus the 1970s, their hemoglobin A1Cs may be 5. They're very normal. Their fasting blood sugars are absolutely normal. If they give a glucose tolerance test where you take a drink of 75 grams of sugar of glucose and wait 2 hours, their blood sugar comes down. But if you measure their insulin levels, it's taking 4 times normal insulin levels to keep their blood sugar normal. And that's already packing fat into their liver. If you, anybody, even teenagers, if you see a belly on anybody, a little protrusion, it means that they have high insulin levels and they have excess fat in their liver. That's where it all starts. So the test that we do, we call it the insulin secretion test or insulin resistant test. It was actually developed by Dr. Joseph Kraft in the 1970s. He finally died recently at age 94. And unfortunately, he did great work. Unfortunately, it was not recognized by the nutrition establishment, including the American Diabetes Association. Partly, you could only measure insulin levels in the 1960s. The developers of it got the Nobel Prize, and it hasn't been measured clinically until very recently. But he did the measurements when it was very expensive, but on 15,000 patients. And he found that, he called it diabetes in situ. I call it, it's kind of a medical term, I call it pre-diabetes, because anybody with high insulin levels is having problems already, whether they know it or not, including the depression. There is an epidemic of colon cancer in young people, breast cancer, which are related to high levels of insulin. And so the real test you need, which I'd like to give Kraft credit and call it the Kraft test, is you take the insulin, the glucose drink, which was given in the traditional oral glucose tolerance test. All pregnant women today get the oral glucose tolerance test. And instead of just measuring blood sugar, you measure insulin levels. And so many people who have bellies, and some are what we call TOFI, they're thin on the outside and fat on the inside. If you look with a CT scan, a CAT scan of their belly, they have belly fat, even though from the outside you would never realize it. And so you can really only tell, you could do it if you do a special MRI of the liver, but that's too expensive and not practical. The Kraft insulin secretion test is not expensive. The main thing is it's done over 2 hours. You do a fasting insulin level, then you drink the glucose, and then you repeat it at 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, and 2 hours. And so we see patients who already have plaque in their coronary arteries. They have all kinds of chronic illness, and their A1C is normal. And so the fact is, it takes years to develop. The fat is not only your liver, it's also in your pancreas. And it's not till your pancreatic beta cells that make insulin, that synthesize insulin, become injured by the fat in the pancreas, and you can't make enough insulin to keep your blood sugar normal. That's when your A1C, your fasting blood sugar goes up. And that's when we diagnose you have a problem, prediabetes or diabetes. But in fact, 10, 20 years before, you can measure high insulin levels, and people are suffering from, again, skin problems, to having cancer, to heart disease, when they're told your blood sugar is normal, don't worry about it. So it's so important to understand, if you have a belly, you have high insulin levels, you're at risk of having heart disease, diabetes, and cancer, and Alzheimer's, even though your doctor may say your blood sugar is normal. So it's very important to get that word out.
Right. And then the calcium score is basically going to tell us how much plaque is built up already.
Yes. So the calcium score I developed with my colleague Warren Janowitz. And if you're heading for a heart attack, if say you're 40 years old and you're heading for a heart attack when you're 50, 55, 60, you will already have plaque in your coronary arteries. And with the calcium score, it's inexpensive. In Miami, it's $99. At Johns Hopkins, it's $75 to have the test. You can, and it's essentially no radiation. It's a CAT scan that has some radiation, but you get more radiation when you fly any distance. So the radiation is not an issue. The cost is really not an issue. And even though your cholesterol might be normal, things can look normal. But again, if you have a lot of small LDL particles and other problems that are hidden, you may be developing plaque. And you can't tell with a cholesterol test or an LDL test or any other test. Here you're looking directly in the coronaries with a safe, inexpensive test. And that tells you what your risk is of a future heart attack. But it predicts all-cause mortality, because it indicates how the various risk factors for chronic disease are mixing in you as an individual. So the one thing that we see now is we see people whose hemoglobin A1C, their blood sugars are normal, but they have high insulin levels. They may have some other genetic markers that we look for, because my practice is cardiac prevention, but those tests are not so difficult to get either. But the main thing is that with the high insulin levels, the sugar and bad carbs they're consuming is turning into fat in the liver. And they're overloading the liver with fat that cause a lot of problems. But one thing it does is it turns the normal LDL into small, dense LDL, small LDL particles that are not cleared by in the bloodstream easily. They don't fit into their usual receptors. They become oxidized, and the oxidized LDL sticks to the vessel wall. It gets underneath the vessel wall, builds up the plaque. And we, again, can see with the calcium score, you can see the buildup of that plaque and the result of the high insulin levels years before you get chest pain or a heart attack. And you can monitor it, and then you can prevent it.
And I think that's huge. There was so many of the tests and the things that we get diagnosed, we're already sick. And this is an opportunity for you to catch it much, much earlier. Even if the other tests are coming out relatively clean, these are really cool. I really appreciate this, because I remember interviewing Dr. Fung in his book about the obesity code. And back then, he's like, it doesn't make any sense to measure insulin because you're doing it fasted. You're doing it one time, but here's some advancement where we're saying, no, let's go ahead and test the other side of this glucose equation, basically using the same test, just looking at the actual insulin response, which I think that's just brilliant.
And I admire Dr. Fong a lot. And but you can't just measure the fasting insulin. We have people with normal fasting insulins, and particularly young people at 30 minutes after the glucose load, their insulin levels are in the hundreds, whereas their fasting glucose is normal. in older patients, you get more and more of the delay in the increase in the insulin, which indicates dysfunction of the beta cells in the pancreas that are making insulin. And that's because fat, we know that you get a fatty liver years again before you're diabetic or even pre-diabetic. And the fat is also going into your pancreas and interfering with the beta cells. And so you get a delay in the insulin secretion. So we can see both the degree of insulin resistance and the degree of what we call beta cell dysfunction, the pancreatic dysfunction, that eventually is going to lead to the high blood sugars when you can no longer make enough insulin to keep the blood sugar normal. And the other thing with this delay in the production of insulin is the insulin peaks hours after a meal, and it stays high. And that's that high insulin level that is locking in the fat after a meal. So when people get up in the middle of the night starving, even though they have all these fat stores in their belly, in their liver, in their muscle, the problem is they have sustained high insulin levels that blocks the enzymes that breaks down the fat and gives you the energy. In the hibernating bear, late in the fall, the bear is there eating the fruit that's become ripe. That's why fruit is seasonal. And they are ravenous, depleting the forest of blueberries and other berries, even though the bear has already put on 400, 600 pounds of fat, but they don't have access to the fat because their insulin level is high. So they continue to put on the fat for the winter hibernation. Once they're hibernating and they're not consuming that fruit and the fructose in the fruit, then their insulin levels drop. Now they have access to the fat, and that's how they hibernate the whole winter without eating, because it's that fat that is helping their brain, their kidneys, their heart to continue to function while they're asleep. So normally when we sleep every night, we're not eating, so we're accessing our stored starch and fat. But when our insulin levels are high, we can't. So the blood sugar falls, and we wake up in the middle of the night starving and go down to the refrigerator and have whatever sugar and carbs are there to bring our blood sugar back up. So it becomes a really vicious cycle.
Yes, it does. And so I think this is, we're into January here. And I think so this is kind of a great time to look at something like the Keto-Friendly South Beach Diet, because it's going to help you regulate your insulin. It's going to help you kind of go through a good period now where you can be thinking in terms of the bear or humans and what we would and wouldn't be eating. The rules are pretty simple. You do have meal plans in there and recipes, so it's all put together very well. So again, I think this is an excellent opportunity to take something that worked. The South Beach Diet definitely was one of those things that people, when they follow it, it worked, and you've improved it, which I think, again, is just wonderful.
Well, thank you so much. And Alan, I mean, you really got it. And part of the book is certainly understanding the principles, because even, for me, who was a cardiologist, diet doctor, putting my patients on diets for years, but I didn't understand the addiction aspect. Once I did, it made such a difference for me, and it is for my patients. So this was not necessarily eating differently. I mean, it was the understanding that made me stick to principles that I already knew. So understanding the role of insulin and how it's different for all of us, and understanding flexibility, but understanding that America is not overweight because we all of a sudden lost our discipline, or for that matter, stopped exercising. Exercise is very, very important. But what's caused the obesity and chronic disease epidemic is mainly the way we're eating.
I define wellness as being the healthiest, fittest, and happiest you can be. What are 3 strategies or tactics to get and stay well?
Boy, I would say understand insulin, keep it down, don't snack between meals, try some intermittent fasting. And others is getting a good night's sleep. And this enters in, of course, if you're overweight and have sleep apnea, you may not be able to sleep well. But we know lack of sleep, again, it stimulates enzymes and hormones that lead to high insulin levels. And the other is regular exercise. And exercise is not going to be a solution from the calorie burning aspects. They proved that in Biggest Loser. But for your brain, for insulin sensitivity, for keeping up lean body mass, and I love your podcast and the being well over 40 plus, that we have to keep our muscle and our bone. And when we weigh ourselves, it's the weight and the BMI doesn't really mean anything, because that includes muscle, bone, and fat under our skin, what we call the subcutaneous fat. It's only the fat in and around our organs that's the dangerous fat that we have to worry about. And regular exercise, it improves our brain function, it improves our sensitivity to insulin, so it decreases insulin resistance, and it helps us age with a sustained lean body mass and our balance, and so many things that's part of healthy aging. And I agree with you, wellness, we use the term optimal health, and it's your vitality. And again, what's kept me on the changes in the diet that I've made is vitality, my ability to exercise, my ability to concentrate, get rid of the brain fog. And it's all those things. My belly was often hidden. People couldn't see it by wearing clothes, but I knew it was there. But it's because I feel so much better with this type of lifestyle. So, it's sleeping right, exercising right, and eating right. And as you age, you have to be more and more concerned about each of these elements. And so I really applaud what you do with 40 plus. As we age, we do become more insulin resistant, and it becomes tougher and tougher. And you have to get enough sleep, enough exercise, and eat the right foods and not eat too often.
Great. Thank you for that. So, Dr. Agatston, if someone wanted to learn more about you or learn more about the book, the new Keto-Friendly South Beach Diet, where would you like for me to send them?
The South Beach Diet website with Activity Health, it changed recently.
Okay, that's cool. No, just send me the link and I'll make sure in the show notes. So you can go to 40 plus.
The AgatstonCenter.com is our office website that has a lot of the information too.
Cool. Well, you can go to 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/416, and I'll be sure to have those links there. So, Doctor, thank you so much for being a part of 40 Plus Fitness.
Thank you, Alan, so much. It was really enjoyable.
It's that time of year. It's the time of year when everybody is thinking about health and fitness. Maybe you've set some resolutions. Maybe this is the year that you want to get healthy and fit. And if it is, and you need a little bit of help, check it out at 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/coach. You can come on as a group client, and I can help you lose weight, get stronger, and make 2020 something special. Go to 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/coach. Next time on the 40 Plus Fitness Podcast, we meet Janet Bristier and discuss medical tourism. Until then, have a happy and healthy week.